As Keir Starmer has slowly been walked off the proverbial plank, the question of the UK's relationship with the EU has once again risen to the fore, as his potential successors have tried to charm Labour's overwhelmingly Europhilic party membership. Former UK Health Secretary Wes Streeting, the first cabinet member to move against Starmer, said last month he wanted to one day rejoin the EU, while Andy Burnham, Starmer's presumed successor, has said he wants to rejoin and expects it to happen in his lifetime. Unsurprisingly, this has sparked some excitable headlines about the UK maybe rejoining the EU. So in this video, we thought we'd explain why, as popular as the idea might be, it isn't going to happen anytime soon. Recent elections in Denmark, Slovenia, Bulgaria and Hungary have shaken up the state of European politics, with major new trends emerging. We dissect these elections in the latest issue of our magazine, as well as explaining what's changing in Europe. That's just one of 80 pages in the magazine, because there's more in too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So there were basically two big reasons to be sceptical of the UK rejoining the EU anytime soon. The first is that, while headline polls sometimes suggest that Brits are keen to rejoin, when you dig into the data, the picture quickly starts to look a lot more mixed. A YouGov poll from earlier this month, for instance, found that an impressive 55% of Brits were apparently in favour of rejoining the EU, while just 34% were opposed to the idea. This is a remarkable level of enthusiasm. Not only does it imply a 20-point lead for rejoin, it's also a higher level of support for accession than in many of the EU's current member states. Another YouGov poll from January, for instance, found that only 45% of French people and 46% of Italians would vote to stay in the EU if a referendum were held. However, if you ask Brits whether they would like to rejoin the EU but without the opt-outs the UK previously enjoyed, in other words, joining not only the EU but also the Eurozone and the Schengen area, which the EU would almost definitely insist upon as part of any new accession bid, then support falls to just 35%, with only 17% of Brits saying they would strongly support rejoining on these terms. Conversely, 43% of Brits would oppose rejoining on these terms, with 30% of Brits saying they'd strongly oppose this. Support would presumably fall even further once Brits realised that, along with the opt-outs, there would also be essentially zero chance of the UK negotiating another so-called rebate, the financial mechanism negotiated by Margaret Thatcher that reduced the UK's contributions to the EU budget. The rebate was a pretty incredible deal for the UK. It essentially reduced the UK's net contributions by about 2/3 in an average year. This would imply that, if the UK were to rejoin, its net contributions to the EU budget would essentially triple, and that's before you account for the fact that the EU budget has grown dramatically since Brexit. Similarly, you would expect support to fall even further once Brits realise that rejoin would potentially be as long and arduous a process as Brexit was. After all, there's a long backlog of candidate countries for the EU to get through first before the UK, and the politics of rejoin would be uniquely contentious inside the EU, given how much of a headache Brexit caused. In short, the point we're trying to make is that if you just ask Brits whether they'd like to rejoin, they imagine rejoining on the same terms we left on, with various convenient opt-outs and a generous rebate. Somewhat unsurprisingly, given most Brits think Brexit was a mistake in the first place, they're pretty keen on this. But if you force them to imagine rejoining on the same terms as any other candidate country, without any preferential treatment, and with all the usual hassle, enthusiasm quickly wanes. So that's the first big reason we don't think the UK is likely to rejoin the EU anytime soon. Contrary to what headline polls suggest, Brits don't really want to. The second reason, however, is that even if they did want to rejoin, it would be hard to see the EU letting the UK back in until there was an overwhelming majority in favour of membership. European politicians often make positive sounds about the UK rejoining. French President Emmanuel Macron, for instance, has said the door is always open. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez said he would, quote, absolutely support a British attempt to rejoin. And Finnish President Alexander Stubb even predicted the UK would eventually rejoin, telling Chatham House in March, "We need a UK voice in Europe. We really miss you guys." A recent ECFR poll even found that an overwhelming majority of European citizens, including Eurosceptic voters, would support the UK rejoining. But the worst case scenario from the EU's perspective would be for the UK to rejoin only to elect a Eurosceptic government soon afterwards, which could be frustratingly obstructionist, or, in the worst case scenario, push for another Brexit. To guarantee against this, the EU would presumably, and reasonably, require the UK to demonstrate that there was a clear and lasting majority in favour of membership, and there was little chance of a furiously Eurosceptic government taking the reins anytime soon. The obvious problem here is that, at the moment, this is far from true. According to Politico's poll aggregator, for instance, the two most popular parties in the UK at the moment are Nigel Farage's Reform UK, which is obviously furiously anti-EU, and the Conservatives, who are also generally pretty Eurosceptic. The UK's first-past-the-post electoral system adds another layer of uncertainty to all this, because it means that parties can win majorities on way less than 50% of the popular vote, especially if Britain's politics remains as fragmented as it currently is. This means that, even if a majority of Brits are pro-EU or voted to rejoin in a referendum, this wouldn't be enough to guarantee a pro-EU government. If, say, the pro-EU vote was split between Labour, the Greens and the Lib Dems, as it currently is, Reform could win an outright majority with about 30% of the popular vote. Now, of course, quite a lot here depends on what moves the EU makes in the coming years. If the EU moves towards some sort of tiered structure, which is what people like Macron have been pushing for in order to break the long-standing accession deadlock, or if it redistributes power away from Brussels back towards national governments, as most of the European right would like, then Rejoin might become more feasible. After all, it's easier to imagine the UK attaining some outer tier of EU membership, or maybe joining a slimmed-down EU dominated by a Jordan Bardella-led France. On the other hand, however, if the EU becomes more integrated and more federal in the coming years, then Rejoin will become more difficult, both logistically and politically. The latest issue of our magazine is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I told you about one of the articles at the start of this video, but this issue's truly jam-packed with content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions which have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through the timeline, and reaching the ultimate question, has Trump created the modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss if Britain has become ungovernable. Then, in the EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you expect, as well as looking at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss if we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. That's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've even been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy today.